Trafalgar was the centre point of a series of sea battles that had been going on throughout the period. Britain was fighting France and Spain on the continent and depended on the sea and her sea routes. Napoleon was trying to invade Britain, but couldn't make his move while the British had a large navy that could destroy his fleet before it reached the shore. He planned to get all his fleets together to make one huge armada and then take on England. On October the 21st, 1805, this plan led to one of the most significant battles in British naval history.
Well, it was fought off the Spanish coast off Cape Trafalgar, fairly near to Cadiz, which has been a famous Spanish port for many, many years. And what they used to do in those days, because the combined fleets, which was Spain and France in the main, sort of outnumbered the English fleets by quite a lot, but to stop them sailing and to stop them gaining control of the seas, we blockaded every port on the French and Spanish coastlines, not only around the Atlantic and English Channel, but also in the Mediterranean. So by blockading, we had little groups of ships standing off outside the harbours, and some of those were there for several years. And this stopped the opposing fleets coming out, because they knew if they came out, they would be engaged. And this was one way of stopping. It was a huge undertaking, and they were out there in all sorts of weather. But it was a marvellous feat of seamanship, really. But eventually, of course, in bad weather, or just after a storm, when the blockading ships were split up, then of course it was possible for people to escape from ports, and Villeneuve tried this once and he had to go back, and then of course they did get out and went to the West Indies, but he went back to the safety of a port rather than take on the British. Napoleon was getting angry with Villeneuve because he knew that Villeneuve had to defeat the English fleet somewhere. And he wanted him to take them on, but obviously Villeneuve may have been a bit worried, may have been scared, I'm not sure, obviously. Napoleon actually sent a replacement admiral to take over from Villeneuve. But Villeneuve got wind of this, and so he set sail before this replacement admiral arrived. 19th and 20th of October, he started gathering his fleet outside Cadiz. Nelson had by then taken over command of the fleet blockading Cadiz. What he did, he withdrew all his ships 50 or 60 miles to the northwest, out of range of all the lookouts and so on in Cadiz, all the big lookout posts on the mountains and the hills rather. All he did, he left a few frigates outside the port and one or two dotted along in the Atlantic between him and the port. By this means, if Villeneuve did leave Cadiz, they would send messages by flags, obviously, and relay these to the main fleet, which was in the distance. Nelson devised this plan whereby he'd attack Villeneuve once he came out. He hoped to attack him in two lines, sort of broadside on to the French and Spanish. The French and Spanish, once they realised Nelson was waiting for them, he came after them very, very slowly because of the weather conditions. They turned and tried to get back to Cadiz, but obviously they were intercepted before they got there. Nelson led one of the lines, and Admiral Collingwood, who's one of his best friends, led the other line. And so they were trying to go into the enemy fleet and split them into three parts. That was his sort of unique plan. It had been used similarly, but in a much smaller scale occasionally before, but only once or twice, and it was really almost revolutionary. As they got nearer, the front English ships, obviously Nelson was in the Victory, and he led his line. All his officers wanted him to go back 2 or 3 ships for safety, because the very front ships, Admiral Collingwood was in the Royal Sovereign as he led the other line. But for 30 or 40 minutes, both lines were taking a tremendous battering from the enemy ships, because they were broadside onto the English ships. The English ships couldn't fire at them because they were just showing their bows to them and approaching at something like 1.5 knots because of the wind conditions, so it must have seemed an eternity to get. So the front English ships in both lines took a tremendous battering. And but once they got in amongst the enemy, obviously the enemy were really frightened of this happening, because as soon as Collingwood was the first to get there, and he sailed his ship directly between two other ships, a Spanish and a Frenchman, and of course he could give them full broadsides in the stern and the bows, and the stern's the most unprotected part of the ship really, and they decimated the enemy ships in that sense. And then as soon as they'd done that, they tried to come aboard another ship, and so basically they were firing broadsides. When they picked an opponent out, they were basically 2 or 3 yards away, sometimes locked together with the masts, and just firing broadside after broadside into each other from 2 or 3 yards. It was just amazing to think about it. So that's the way the battle unfolded. The other thing, of course, when they were actually going into battle, it's where John Quilliam came into the action. Nelson had made him his first lieutenant, which was quite a senior post. As they were approaching the enemy, as I said, a lot of damage was caused and they were unable to return fire. Because at that time you'd have 7 or 8 ships firing full broadsides at them. So you can imagine the damage that was caused. And partly through part of a mast being hit and falling on the wheel, and another cannonball actually hitting the wheel was destroyed. So Hardy was the captain of the Victory. He asked Quilliam to go below with the ship's master. He'd take about 40 men down there, and they rigged up a jury rig, as it's called, and sailed the Victory from below decks. Until it collided with the Redoutable, and then obviously they were used for other things then, and then when it broke free, obviously they were back below deck sailing the Victory again. So very important part of the battle John Quilliam took up there. And after the battle, of course, he was rewarded. He was given one of the prize ships and made a captain, so that again was a great honour for him.
Captain Quilliam was born in Marown, strangely enough, the only parish without a sea boundary, and the son of a farmer, although there seems to have been family involvement with the sea previously. The farm was sold, they moved into Douglas, and there seemed to have been family problems, and that's the point at which John disappears to reappear a bit later on in the Navy. He started out quite early, getting promotions, working his way through the various ranks of mates and so on. And then finally he was involved in the Battle of Camperdown, and most of the senior officers on his ship were killed or injured, and he was appointed as an acting lieutenant. At that time he had already been at sea the requisite 6 years which you are needed at sea for you to be able to take your lieutenant's exams, and he obviously took his exams and passed, and was then appointed to a whole series of ships as a sort of midshipman and all the rest of it, working his way from below decks to above. And he eventually was appointed as a lieutenant. Served on a number of ships, including a frigate, which made a very nice capture. It was part of a small fleet which captured a couple of Spanish treasure ships, and out of the prize money situation he received £5,000, which at that time was like winning the lottery now. And that was really what set him up in life. After that, still as a lieutenant, he was appointed to a ship which was involved in the Battle of Copenhagen. And during that battle, his captain was killed, and he took command of the ship. It's always said that Nelson came on board and asked who was in charge, and the voice comes up from down below decks that I am, and then asked how he was getting on, middling. But it seems highly unlikely again that Nelson was wandering around the fleet. I think he was a bit too busy writing letters to the Prince of Denmark and others to sort out the end of the battle. But after that, it did bring him in contact with a captain called Sutton, who was a very close friend and I think relative of Nelson's, when the Victory prepared to go to sea again after the Peace of Amiens broke, and when Nelson was appointed to her as Admiral. And that seems to have been the point at which it all started. He went to the Victory and was appointed first lieutenant. He wasn't the senior lieutenant by date of passing of exams or anything, but that wasn't the way that Nelson and his immediate friends seemed to work. They chose people according to what their abilities were, and Pascoe, who was actually the senior lieutenant, because he had a special knowledge of signalling and flags, was made flag lieutenant, and of course he was the one responsible for the famous signal at the start of the battle. Quilliam, in the same way, was an expert in repairs, running of a ship, and that was his role. He was the executive officer, that was his job, and he seems to have been very good at doing it.
Well, because of their seamanship, they would go to school, to the mathematical school, that would be in Market Street in Peel, and they would be taught geometry, trigonometry, compass points, sextant, and all things nautical law, and they would be very proficient at it. Lots of people went on to be very good sailors and be masters of their own ship, and they would sail to many foreign parts. And obviously a lot of the lads went to sea. Some didn't even bother going to sea. They became bootmakers or shopkeepers. Some would be bankers, some would be lawyers. But generally they were taught seamanship. Being a small island, surrounded by the sea, as islands are usually. But that's why they were chosen for Nelson's Navy. I believe there's about 60 Manxmen, maybe even more, at the Battle of Trafalgar itself. They say that the British Navy had about 3,000 Manxmen taken, whether they joined up or whether they were impressed. And the press gangs were taken them. And it is said that the press gang officer, whether he was a captain or a lieutenant, he would get twice as much for a Manxman for the Manxman's knowledge of the sea.
Well, the whole background of the island was based on the sea. The whole of that century, the 18th century, it had seen the involvement with the Manx in the running trade, and not only in the smaller ships going out from the island to land cargoes on the surrounding shores, but more particularly on the traders coming into the island, bringing goods in. And then as time went on, and particularly after revestment, the emphasis changed, and the whole setup went much more to the Africa trade, and also the overseas trade, the other overseas trade. And because of that, the Manx had this involvement with the sea. They had a very high reputation as sailors, and many of the important ships of that time had quite a number of Manx crew on board them. And of course this was the case with Trafalgar. You had this scattering of men right through the fleet. Something like all but 6 or 7 of the 33 ships involved on the British side had Manxmen on board, often just in 1s and 2s. In some cases, in one case, there was 9 on board one ship. But they, in another sense, show what happened, how they got there, because they had all come through the Portsmouth receiving ship. And although they are marked as having been volunteers when they actually signed on to the books, they were largely landsmen. So the implication is that these were people who had been picked up by the press and had decided that if you can't beat them, you might as well join them. And rather than being put on the books as a pressed man, they might just as well go on as a volunteer and get whatever bounty was due to them.
After the battle, one of the last things Nelson said to Hardy was, "Anchor, anchor, you must anchor." And this was still while the battle was going on, but obviously they were getting the better of the enemy fleets. But they didn't anchor because Hardy took control of the fleets while the battle was still on and while Nelson was alive. But once Nelson had died, which was just at the end of the battle or just after it, Collingwood took over control of the fleets. So then, instead of having a fleet of 27 vessels, he inherited a fleet of 27 plus 13 or 14 that they'd actually captured, apart from those that were there, and plus one or two, all the little frigates and everything else. So he had a fleet of about 50 vessels to look after when a storm was brewing, and it was one of the worst storms ever. Well, up that point, it was the worst storm ever recorded. In Britain, it was known as the Great Storm of 1805. And you can imagine, out of 50 vessels, about a third of them hadn't got any masts at all. And many of these were being towed by the smaller ships or those in better condition. And they were all trying to head for Gibraltar. And as they were being towed, the storm hit them. And the storm raged for the best part of a week. And, of course, many people died in the storm. Ships were lost. Again, none of the British ships actually were lost, but one or two of the prize ships were lost. The British sailors, to their credit, made great efforts to save as many of the prisoners and as many of the other crews as they could. Other ships were wrecked on the rocks near Cadiz, and so it was a pretty disastrous scene after. In fact, I think they only got back with about 4 of the prize ships. And again, so that was a particular honour for Quilliam to be given one of those prize ships as a prize, his first captaincy, in fact.
We're at the steps just to the right-hand side of the War Memorial and the square, looking towards Castle Rushen. But before us, we also see the Speaker's Garden, which is a small enclosed gardened area, which is very pretty and very popular for particularly people who want to take an outside sandwich lunch. And as we can see as we walk down, there's a nice open squared area, and it's dark stoned slabs, which will give perhaps a feeling more in keeping with the ambience of the area. And just towards the middle and the back, near the wall of the castle, there will be the location for the statue. Well, the idea was a compromise outcome from a Tynwald debate, where I'd put the motion forward that we should have a national holiday to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Trafalgar, and particularly the role of Captain Quilliam and the other 69 Manx men who served at the battle. And the government's amendment was to the effect that instead they would commission and fund a permanent memorial in the form of a statue, engaging Brian Neal, a world-renowned Manx sculptor who has designed and had cast a very imposing waist upwards statue of Quilliam in life-size plus 1/3, I think, is the scale. So it will look very imposing without taking away any of the ambience and the impact of this area that we currently enjoy, and will be enhanced by the statue.
I was very excited by the idea. I knew quite a lot about Quilliam, to some extent, come from Castletown, and so I set to work on a model, and it went really well. I was really pleased with it. So And we worked, I had several chaps working with me, and we worked very, very fast and very hard and got it done and down to the foundry by the 8th of August. And last week it arrived here on the island. But it has been quite a pressurized business. But I was really interested in it. I really wanted to do it. I hope that people like it. That's the main thing. The only brief was they said they would like a half length, which suited me quite well. And I had to go on. There are 3 pictures of them the museum have. One is a painting or a photograph of a painting which must have been done by somebody who did sort of sign boards for pubs or something or other. It could be anybody when he was a young man, and that was much use. And then there's a very good portrait of him which showed him when he must have been about 35, which would be at the height of his career actually. And then there's a semi-destroyed painting of an old man, which half the paint is, disintegrated. So that's what I had to go on. But we also had his uniform, and we had a lot of his history. He had a heroic and desperately interesting career as in the Navy. But I think it's a tremendous character. But the more I read about what it was like to be engaged in those battles, made me feel that I had to present him as a person of literally indomitable will and enormous strength of personality. He must have had it. I mean, there's the battles that took place, the hideous scenes of carnage, and cannonballs fly, great lumps of broken timber, mass crushing down, smoke and battle, blood everywhere. And this man fought in endless battles like that, even toward the end of his career in the Navy, capturing an American ship in the American War of Independence.
We remember him, his fortitude, for his courage, but also as an example, I think, of Manx, of all those Manx men who have served in the Navy before Quilliam and after.
Quilliam, of course, went to sea, came back after Trafalgar, and then I gather went to sea again. Now, he doesn't seem to have lived in Castletown until he got married. He didn't get married till 1817. The person he married was Margaret Christian Stevenson, who was one of the daughters of the Stevenson family of Balladul, one of the largest landed families on the island, and for many centuries one of the most prominent families. Now, she had connections in Castletown because she was the owner of the house we're standing in front of now, Balcony House as it's now called, in the Parade being the seaward end of what people generally call Castletown Square. The Parade, of course, because when we had a garrison they would parade there from their barracks to the garrison church. Now, the house that's here now is a late Georgian house, a very handsome house, 3 stories, 3 bays, that means 3 windows each side, on each story. There's a rather elaborate door case, lovely fanlight above it. It's the tallest house in the square and one of the most dominant features. So we can date it to just 1788 or just afterwards. No doubt it was embellished later. The story is that the mahogany doors are mahogany that was brought back by Quilliam from one of his voyages. Whether that's true, I don't know, but it's quite possible. After all, houses are always being done up. It was the next stage in its evolution. But the Curwins died. Mr. and Mrs. Curwin died more or less one after the other in 1808, and the house was left to Margaret, who was the unmarried daughter, together with quite a lot of other property in the Castletown area. And we assume that she lived there as a spinster for the next 9 years until she then married Captain Quilliam. Now, quite how they divided their time, we don't know. There are no real censuses, therefore. In those days, there weren't even real addresses. People were just described by the town or parish, not by the actual place they lived. But I think it's reasonable to suppose that the Captain and Mrs. Quilliam would have spent some time at Balcony House, but perhaps spent other times at one of the other residences. Quilliam was, of course, a member of the House of Keys, which met in Castletown in those days. So, again, on the days when that met, a townhouse would have been useful. And Balcony House would have been one of the most important houses in the town.
Quilliam came back to the island a few times. He came back in the Peace of Amiens. He was here then. That's prior to going on board the Victory. After the Victory, he was appointed, first of all, a commander and then a post captain. He was in charge of a bomb ship called the Etna, which was on stop and search duties out of Gibraltar. And he was on that for a few months. And then he was transferred from that to captain a ship called the San Ildefonso, which was one of the very few prizes taken at Trafalgar which ever got back to Britain, because most of them were either too far damaged or in fact sunk in the gales which followed the battle. But he brought one of them, the San Ildefonso, back, and at that point in time he then comes home from the sea on half pay. He later goes back to sea again, comes home and then goes back again, and serves for a few more years till finally he decides that's it, or the Navy decides, or mutually they decide, and he then goes permanently on half pay. After Trafalgar, he was actually appointed to the House of Keys in that spell. He retained that membership during his first spell back at sea, but when it was obvious that he was going to be more permanently at sea, he resigned from the Keys. But almost as soon as he finally got back, he was reappointed to the Keys. So for the rest of his life, he was a member of the House of Keys. He was a landed gentleman in the sense that he had lots of money and had bought properties. But he also married the daughter of one of the most important families on the island, Stevensons of Balladule, and they set home together. At that stage he was 46, she was 47, but nevertheless they seem to have had a quiet but enjoyable life.
The voices of Frank Cowan, Jonathan Cooley, Quinton Gill, Brian Neal, Roy Baker and Earl Law.